There's something different about people who were the middle child, because this wasn't just a birth order position. It forged a specific psychological pattern that researchers are only now beginning to decode. Let's start with something that would be considered emotional neglect today, but was just called being a middle child. Imagine you're 6 years old, sitting at the kitchen table during family dinner. Your older sibling is talking about their achievement at school, something they won or accomplished. Your parents are listening, asking questions, fully engaged. Then your younger sibling interrupts with something cute or funny, and everyone laughs, turns their attention, starts gushing over how adorable they are. And you're sitting there between these two performances, watching the spotlight shift from one to the other. You open your mouth to say something, but the moment has passed, the conversation has moved on, and nobody noticed you were about to speak. This wasn't a single moment. This was the pattern. And here's what happened in your brain during those early years. Every time attention flowed around you instead of to you, every time you watched the oldest get privileges for being first and the youngest get indulgence for being small, your neural pathways were building something specific. An ability to exist without constant validation. You'd watch your older sibling set the rules through precedent. You'd watch your younger sibling break those same rules and get away with it because they were just little. And you were held to the standard without getting the credit, expected to follow without getting the exception. This constant state of being, neither first nor last, wasn't neglect. It was freedom. And it created what psychologists call developed self-sufficiency. You learned early that you couldn't rely on positional advantage, that you had to find your own way, that your identity couldn't come from birth order privilege because you didn't have one. Now imagine you're 9 years old and you want something, a toy, a privilege, permission to do something. Your older sibling got it at age 9. So you go to your parents with what seems like perfect logic. They got to when they were my age. And your parents say, that was different. They were more mature. Or, we've learned since then. Or, you're not your brother. So you wait. You figure you'll get it when you're the age your older sibling was when they got it. But when you reach that age, your younger sibling gets it earlier because you got it at that age. So it's only fair they do too. This wasn't unfair. It was being the adjustment variable. And it created something unexpected. A deep understanding that the rules weren't actually about fairness. They were about what worked for each specific person at each specific time. While other birth orders might fight for equal treatment, middle children developed adaptive thinking early. They understood that the family system had to flex and change. That consistency wasn't always possible. That sometimes you got less not because you deserved less, but because you were easier to say no to. Psychologists call this systemic flexibility. But for you, it was just knowing that nothing you did existed in isolation. But this ability to see cascading effects created an unexpected problem that researchers are only now connecting to middle child burnout patterns. Because when you learn young that rules shift based on who's asking, you develop a dangerous skill, the ability to read what people want and become it. Let's talk about those moments when you wanted to quit something. Piano lessons you hated, soccer practice you dreaded, that club you joined because it sounded good but turned out to be boring. You're sitting with your parents trying to explain that you want to stop, and they say something like, well, what kind of message does that send to your brother? He just started lessons because he looks up to you. So you stayed, not because you wanted to, not because you loved piano or soccer or whatever activity, but because quitting meant you were teaching someone else that quitting was acceptable. This wasn't manipulation, it was responsibility. And it created a specific psychological pattern. Middle children learned that their choices were never entirely their own, that personal preferences took a backseat to modeling behavior. Years later, in jobs, in relationships, in life, these are the people who stay in difficult situations longer than they probably should. Not because they're martyrs or doormats, but because they learned young to adapt rather than push back. That making themselves fit the situation feels easier than demanding the situation change to fit them. What researchers call elevated persistence threshold sounds clinical. But you just knew that giving up wasn't really an option when someone was watching you to learn how to handle hard things. Fast forward to a random Tuesday afternoon. Your parents need to run errands. They look at you and say, "Watch your younger brother for an hour. We'll be right back." You're 10, maybe 11. Your younger sibling is 6 or 7. And suddenly you're in charge. Not playing together, not hanging out. In charge. You make them a snack. You settle an argument about what to watch on TV. You make sure they don't do anything dangerous. And when your parents come home, they don't praise you extensively. They just say thanks like you did something normal. This pattern repeated hundreds of times throughout your childhood. Before you could drive, you were responsible for another human being. Before you had your own life figured out, you were managing someone else's immediate needs. This wasn't parentification. It was leadership training before you knew you were learning it. And something got wired deep into your brain, authority before you were ready for it. You learned to make decisions when you didn't feel qualified, to project confidence when you felt uncertain, to be the calm presence even when you were anxious inside. While other kids were still in pure childhood, middle children were getting repetitions in a skill that most people don't develop until their 20s or 30s. How to be responsible for outcomes that affect other people. What psychologists call premature authority integration was just you making sure your younger sibling didn't stick a fork in the electrical outlet while your parents were at the grocery store. And what nobody tells you about developing leadership skills this early is that it comes with a psychological cost that shows up decades later in the most unexpected ways. Now let's talk about the moment you got in trouble for something. Really in trouble. Maybe you failed a test. Maybe you snuck out. Maybe you lied about something important. Your parents' disappointment wasn't just about you. It was laced with something else. Concern about what this meant for your siblings. What if they think this is okay? What if they follow your example? Your mistake wasn't private. It was instructional. Your failure became a teaching moment for someone else before you'd even processed it yourself. This wasn't cruelty. It was the reality of being first. And it created something psychologically complex. You learned that your mistakes had an audience. That getting caught wasn't just about consequences for you. It was about what message it sent to the younger kids watching. So you developed something researchers call anticipatory guilt. The ability to feel bad about something before you even do it, based on imagining how it might influence others. While other birth orders might take risks and deal with consequences after, middle children learn to calculate ahead of time the ripple effects. To consider not just, will I get in trouble, but what will this teach my siblings about what's acceptable? This created adults who are intensely aware of how their behavior affects systems around them, who think 3 steps ahead about consequences, who sometimes struggle to be spontaneous because they're always calculating downstream effects. But that calculating mind became useful in unexpected ways. Picture holiday time. The family is gathering, plans are being made, and somehow, without anyone officially assigning the role, you're the one coordinating everything. You're texting siblings about what time everyone can arrive. You're checking with parents about dietary restrictions. You're making sure someone picks up the thing that needs to be picked up. You're mediating between family members who have conflicting preferences. No one asked you to project manage Thanksgiving, but you did it anyway. Because somewhere deep in your psychology, you learned that if you don't organize the system falls apart. This wasn't control freakishness. It was pattern recognition. You watched what happened when nobody coordinated, when everyone assumed someone else would handle logistics, when plans fell through because no one took ownership. So you became the person who takes ownership. Not because you love administrative tasks, but because you learned young that someone has to make sure all the pieces fit together, and that someone was usually you. What researchers call default leadership assumption sounds fancy, but you were just making sure everyone knew what time dinner was. But the calculating mind that made you good at organizing had a darker side that psychologists are calling the invisible burden, because when you're the one who always steps up, you never learn how to let things fall apart. Then came those moments in school where you watched your younger sibling struggle with something you'd already been through. The hard teacher, the difficult subject, the social situation you remembered navigating. Your parents would look at you and say, "Can you help them with this?" You already know how to do it. So you became a teacher before you were ready to teach. You explained concepts you just barely mastered yourself. You translated your own recent struggles into advice for someone 3 steps behind you on the same journey. This pattern of learning something then immediately having to teach it created a unique relationship with knowledge. You couldn't just absorb information passively. You had to understand it well enough to explain it to someone else. This wasn't burden. It was accelerated mastery that most people don't get until adulthood. What psychologists call recursive learning, this process of learning then teaching, is one of the most effective ways to achieve deep understanding. But for middle children, it wasn't a study technique. It was just how family worked. These are the people who, decades later, are naturally good at mentoring, who can break down complex ideas for others, who don't just know things, they know how to transfer knowledge. Because they've been doing it since they were 12 years old, sitting at the kitchen table, helping a younger sibling with homework they'd finished the year before. But all this responsibility came with a shadow side. Something that researchers are only recently beginning to understand about middle child psychology. You're lying in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, and you're running through a mental checklist. Did I set a good example today? Did I do anything that might have been a bad influence? Am I being the person my siblings should look up to? This wasn't occasional reflection. This was chronic self-monitoring, a constant internal audit of whether you were living up to the impossible standard of being worth copying. This wasn't narcissism. It was the weight of being a template for someone else's becoming. You developed what psychologists call identity performance anxiety, the fear that who you actually are might not match who you're supposed to be for the people watching you, while other kids could experiment with different identities, try on different personalities, make mistakes privately. You felt the weight of being a template. Every choice felt like it was being recorded, studied, and potentially replicated. And this performance anxiety created a paradox that most middle children never escape, because the less you demanded attention, the less you got. But the more you demanded it, the more you looked like you were trying too hard. So you learned to exist in a strange limbo, wanting to be seen while pretending not to need it. This created adults who struggle with authenticity, who have a hard time separating who I actually am from who I think I should be, who second-guess spontaneous impulses because they're always calculating whether this version of themselves is the right one to display. Here's the paradox that haunts many middle children. You were given responsibility before you had power. You had to watch siblings, but you couldn't actually discipline them. You had to set an example, but you were still figuring yourself out. You were supposed to be mature, but you were still a kid. This gap between responsibility and authority created a specific psychological tension. You learned to influence without control, to guide without power, to be accountable for outcomes you couldn't directly determine. This wasn't powerlessness. It was learning that real influence doesn't require authority. Decades later, these are the people who excel in middle management positions and struggle in CEO roles, who are brilliant at execution but uncomfortable with ultimate authority, who prefer collaborative leadership to hierarchical power, because they learned young that real influence isn't about having final say. It's about shaping behavior through example, through consistency, through being the steady presence that others orient around. Now, picture family photos, every holiday, every important event. And you're always positioned in a specific way, often in the back, often slightly to the side, often with a sibling in front of you or next to you. This wasn't random positioning. It was visual representation of your role. You were the frame, not always the focus, the context that made the picture make sense. And you internalized this, not consciously, but deep in your psychology. You learned that your job wasn't always to be the center of attention. It was to make space for others to shine while still being present, still being important, still being part of the structure, what researchers call peripheral centrality. This ability to be essential without being spotlight focused. To know that your value isn't determined by visibility. These are adults who can let others take credit while knowing their contribution was crucial, who don't need constant recognition because they learned early that impact and attention aren't the same thing. But let's talk about what happened when you failed at something, really failed. In a visible, public way, the disappointment on your parents' faces wasn't just about your failure. It was layered with concern about precedent. If even you can't do this, What does that mean for your younger sister? Or your older brother did this easily. Your failure felt like it wasn't just yours to carry. It was a statement about family capability, about what was possible for your siblings, about whether the standard was too high or whether you just hadn't met it. This wasn't fair. But it was the template burden. And it created something psychologically complex. You learned that failure was never entirely private, that your struggles were always in the context of what they meant for the family system. So you developed something researchers called collective performance pressure. The weight of feeling like your individual outcomes reflect on more than just you. These are adults who struggle to separate their own goals from family expectations, who sometimes achieve things not because they want them, but because they feel responsible for proving what's possible, who carry the weight of representation in everything they do. And now, decades later, many middle children are sitting at their own kitchen tables, watching their own middle child navigate what they once navigated. They see their kid trying to get attention, while the older one dominates and the younger one charms. They watch their child learn to be flexible, to adapt, to exist without constant validation, and they feel something complicated. Pride, because they recognize that resilience. Concern, because they remember the loneliness of it. And the urge to say what no one said to them. You don't have to hold everything together. You're allowed to need attention too. But here's the twist that researchers didn't expect. The middle children who felt most invisible growing up turned out to be the ones who became the most essential in their adult relationships and careers, not despite the invisibility, but because of it. Because while they were learning to exist without spotlight, they were developing something else. They were learning to see the whole system, to understand how all the pieces fit together, to sense what was needed before anyone asked for it. That invisibility wasn't rejection, it was apprenticeship. All those years of watching attention flow around you instead of to you, of learning to be flexible when others were rigid, of finding your way without positional advantage, of holding the center while others occupied the extremes, of adapting your identity to what was needed. It wasn't damage, it was architecture. Think about what you learned. Systemic thinking before you knew what systems were. The ability to exist without constant validation. Emotional intelligence before you had words for it. The capacity to read what's unspoken and respond to what's needed without being asked. The skill of maintaining equilibrium without controlling outcomes. The flexibility to be genuinely different things in different contexts without losing yourself. The wisdom that value isn't tied to visibility. Your brain was literally wired for complexity, strengthened by adaptation, calibrated by the constant awareness of being neither first nor last. The positional fluidity that felt like having no fixed role. It made you able to move between contexts that would lock others into single identities. You can be the leader when needed and the supporter when that serves better. You can be serious in one arena and playful in another. You can hold authority without demanding it, because you learned early that value isn't tied to position. The preemptive independence that felt like being abandoned to figure things out alone. It made you someone who can function without constant support, who doesn't collapse when help isn't immediate, who can solve problems without needing validation at every step, who trusts their own judgment because you had to develop it early. The adaptive identity formation that felt like never knowing who you really were. It made you someone who isn't trapped by others' expectations, who can relate to different types of people, who can code switch between different worlds, who doesn't need a rigid self-concept to feel secure. Because you learned that identity can be both fluid and authentic. The equilibrium maintenance that felt like invisible labor, it made you the person who can sense when systems are tipping too far in one direction, who can prevent conflicts before they explode, who can hold space for different perspectives without needing to dominate, who creates stability without requiring credit for it. The ambient recognition deficit that felt like chronic invisibility, it made you someone who can achieve without needing applause, who can be genuinely happy for others' success without resentment, who doesn't collapse when you're not the center of attention, who built internal validation because external validation was unreliable. The strategic invisibility that felt like accepting you'd never be the main character, it made you someone who can build influence without title, who can impact systems without needing to be the face of them, who understands that being essential is more powerful than being celebrated, because you learned that visibility and value aren't the same thing. the conversational orchestration that felt like never getting to share your own updates. It made you someone who can manage group dynamics without dominating them, who can create space for connection to happen, who notices who's being left out and brings them in, who understands that facilitating meaningful interaction is more valuable than monopolizing attention. The systemic perception that felt like always being the one who had to hold everything together. It made you someone who can see patterns others miss, who can understand how individual actions create collective outcomes, who can navigate complex situations because you spent your childhood learning that everything connects to everything else. These aren't burdens you need to overcome. They're capabilities most people spend decades trying to develop. And you've been building them since you were 6 years old, sitting at a dinner table between two siblings, learning that attention wasn't your birthright. Your oldest sibling got to be first, the pioneer, the one who set the standard and got the glory. Your youngest sibling got to be protected, the charming one, the one who got grace and indulgence. And for years, you thought they got the better deal, but you got something else, something they'll spend their whole lives trying to learn. You got the architecture of adaptability built into your neural pathways. You got the ability to read systems and sense what's needed. You got the capacity to exist without constant validation. You got the flexibility to be essential without being fixed. You got the wisdom that comes from being neither privileged nor protected. And decades later, when you're in a workplace managing competing priorities, when you're in relationships navigating different needs, when you're in social situations, reading the room and responding to what's unspoken, when you're holding systems together without needing credit, you're not compensating for being the middle child. You're being what you were built to be, the one who can see the whole picture, the adaptive force that holds extremes in balance, the essential presence that doesn't require center stage, the one who understands that the greatest strength isn't being first or last, it's being the one who makes everything in between.